Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to another day of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and I'm so excited for you to join us today because we are going to explore the wonderful world of food webs. So we're going to talk about what a food web is and some of the players that are in a food web, and then we're going to build our own food web. Well, hello, eel. Now, as you're exploring today, if you have any questions or any observations you'd like to share, or you want to answer any of our questions, we would love to hear from you. So I am joined in the studio by Jen, and she is not only controlling all the magic you see behind me, but she's also going to take your questions and observations. And she put this phone number up. That's 562-286-1838. So if you have questions or observations or anything you want to let us know, you just want to say hello, good morning, you can go ahead and text us at that number. Now, if you're watching this program live, so it is March 30th. Ooh, it's almost the end of March. It's March 30th at 9 a.m. You can go ahead and text us. If you're watching after the fact, we would still love to hear from you, especially to answer any questions you have. But we just ask that you email us at live@lbaop.org because we're not always manning that text line, and we do want to be able to answer all your questions. All right, everyone, are you ready to get started? So we're going to start exploring. Now, we're going to be focusing on this habitat today. Do you recognize this habitat? We'll come back to it and make some observations, but the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce some of those players that we find in a food web. But even before that, we're going to define what a food web is. Now, have you heard about a food web before? Sometimes we might talk about a food chain, which is very similar to a food web. Food webs just get a little bit more complex. There's a little bit more movement or activity in a food web. But a food web is basically who eats who in an ecosystem. So if we look at our kelp forest here, and we were to build, well, now we're just looking at some giant sea bass. I do have to let you know that our giant sea bass love the camera. So our camera in our exhibits, these are our live exhibits. It has a glass housing around it, right? We put a camera in the water and then a housing over it to protect it. And our giant sea bass can see themselves in the camera and they just love to look at themselves. So sometimes they steal the show. Again here. But anyways, we can look past our giant sea bass and they'll move on eventually. But if we look at this kelp forest habitat, we can build a food web because the animals in here, they need food to survive, right? That's one of the basic things that any living thing needs to survive is food. And so we can build a food web who eats who in this habitat or in this ecosystem. And that's what we're going to do today. But there are different players. Now to start, when you think about what you eat, there's different terms for what types of things you eat, right? So an animal who eats only plants or algae, like the kelp here, is going to be an herbivore. We can say that word together, herbivore. So things that only eat plants or vegetables are herbivores. So if you are a vegetarian, you are an herbivore because all you're eating are plants or vegetables. Now, that's one category. The second one is a carnivore. Have you heard that term before? Let's say that all together. Carnivore. Now, what do you think a carnivore eats? Only what? If an herbivore eats only plants, carnivores eat only meat. So only other animals, like another fish or any other animal you see swimming around here. If an animal eats only those things, they are a carnivore. So if you only eat steak or chicken or turkey and nothing else, you are a carnivore. You only eat meat. And then there's a third group of people, which most of us watching probably fall into this category. Not everyone, right? Because there are some herbivores, some vegetarians. But most of us are what we call omnivores, or as we like to say here, omnivores, because an omnivore eats everything. So you eat both plants or vegetables and animals or meat. So most of us, I myself, as I am an omnivore because I eat both vegetables, do love my vegetables, but I also like eating meat. So those are some of the players, but we're going to break it down even more. Now, I'm going to go over to my document camera because I wrote out 3 terms for us. So we've got primary producers, primary consumers, and secondary consumers. And this is going to help us look at the levels in a food web or a food chain. So we have who eats who, but each thing that eats another thing fills another level in that food web. So primary producers, they are the first level in our food web. And they're going to be things that are using the sun for energy, like a plant, right? A plant on land is going to use the sun and it's going to photosynthesize, and that's going to give it energy or its food source to help it grow. So it's not physically eating things like we think about putting things in our mouth, but it's using the sun. It's having this chemical process in its body, and that helps it grow. So primary producers are going to be that first level of our food web. And then we get to primary consumers. So this word primary means first. And producers means you're producing something, you're making something. So if we think a plant is making their own energy from the sun, that's why they're a producer. And then primary consumer, primary again is our first. And consumer means you're taking in, you're consuming, like we eat food, you consume your food. So a primary consumer is going to be the first thing that eats a primary producer. So just like it's listed right after it, a primary consumer eats a primary producer. And then we get on to our secondary consumer, which secondary means two or second. So you can understand that a secondary consumer eats a primary consumer because the second one eats the first. And then you can go on more and more. There's tertiary, which is the third, and then on and on and on. But we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to start with these three: primary producer, primary consumer, and secondary consumer. And we're going to build our food web based off of our kelp forest. So we're going to go back to Blue Cavern. Now, Blue Cavern is our kelp forest exhibit here at the aquarium. And this is our webcam, like I mentioned, in our aquarium, so we can see what is happening. And we can build a food web by just looking at the animals that we see here. Now, as we're building today, I am going to draw, and you are welcome to draw with me. I'm going to use a whiteboard like I had written those words on. But if you have any scratch paper or construction paper, or pencil, crayons, color pencils, anything you have available, if you'd like to follow along to build our food web. Of course, you don't have to draw along. You can just listen and ask questions. But let's take a look, and let's first make some observations of our kelp forest. So we can put the idea of a food web kind of to the side, not out of our mind completely, but to the side for a moment. And let's just make some observations. What do you see in this habitat? So we're looking at a kelp forest. Do you see any kelp? What colors do you notice that the kelp is? What is kelp? Are there any other things in here that you recognize? Now remember, you can share those with us. You can text us in. We'll have Jen put that text line back up on the screen. I know it kind of blocks our view a little, but we want to make sure that you know that number in case you'd like to participate. You can just think those thoughts in your brain. You can write them down if you want to take some notes. If you're in class, you can turn to the person next to you, with your teacher's permission, of course, and share with each other. Or if you're watching at home and you're watching with a friend or family member, you can share with them. Or even if you're watching with a pet, you can whisper to your pet. What do you notice? Now, I do notice lots of kelp. And the kelp is going to be all this sort of brownish, greenish stuff. Like this stuff right here is kelp. This bright green, right there, is another type of algae. But kelp is an algae. Now, algae are similar to plants. But like the plants on land that have a root system that digs into the dirt or to the soil, kelp doesn't have a root system like that. Instead, it attaches to the rocks. So these big rocks here, you may have noticed, are super important because they provide an anchor, a place for the kelp to hold on to as it's growing. We got some observations in. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. So you noticed seaweed. Excellent, just like we were talking about. Now, seaweed and kelp, same thing. You might hear us refer to it as one or the other, but it's basically the same thing. So excellent observations, noticing that there is seaweed in this exhibit. We have some big fish. Absolutely. Those giant sea bass are some big fish. And then there are also some small fish. Absolutely. And that's going to be really important in a food web because it's important to have varying sizes of these animals because not every animal is going to be able to eat everything in their habitat. And there are rocks. Excellent. You've all made some excellent observations. Wonderful. So we've got rocks. We've got kelp. We have some big fish. We've got some small fish. I noticed a shark before, and I even noticed an eel. So there's lots of animals who live in this habitat. But now we're going to start to build out that food web. Now, I'm going to go over to my document camera, and the first thing I'm going to draw is the sun. Because we have a primary producer, which is going to use the sun, but we need to make sure we have the sun existing for our primary producer to use. So I'm going to draw a nice big sun, nice and sunny. There is my sun. Now, our primary producer is going to use that sun to help it grow for energy. And in our kelp forest, it's going to be the kelp that primary producer is using the sun. So I'm going to draw my kelp, and then we'll talk a little bit more about a kelp itself. I realized too I should draw the water line so we know where the ocean is, because otherwise it just looks like a plant on land. So here's the water. So we're going to focus on everything below. But if you look at any habitat, whether it's in the water or on land, you're going to find that you can build a food web. Because as I mentioned, it's what eats what. And animals, living things, need food to survive. And so every habitat has a food web. And then I'm going to fold my kelp over, and I'll explain why in just a moment. All right, so there is my kelp. Now, maybe Jen can put us in a real kelp forest. Aha, look at this. Isn't it beautiful? Now, if you ever get a chance to snorkel or dive in a kelp forest, this is what it looks like. And it's really cool because it's like you're walking or swimming through a forest. And it's very peaceful. But this is what it looks like. And what do you notice shining in the water? That's right, the sun. So kelp is an algae, right? It doesn't have that root system. And it uses the sun for energy. And kelp is actually a unique algae. So if you live here in Southern California, kelp might seem like it's sort of the norm, right? We're used to kelp forests. We're used to seeing kelp wash up on the beach because we have it here along our coast. But kelp forests only exist in about 5 places around the world because they need really specific types of water and an ecosystem around it. So the water needs to be really cold and nutrient rich. And our waters here along our Southern California coast fit those characteristics. And so we have really big kelp forests here along our coast. So this kelp likes the water conditions. And with a lot of sunlight, it's going to grow towards the sunlight, right? If your food is in a certain place, you're going to gravitate or you're going to move towards that food. And so our kelp that uses the sun for energy is going to move towards the sun because that's what's going to give it the most food. And so kelp is going to grow upwards towards the surface of the water. Now, in ideal conditions, so if the water is super cold, if there's a lot of nutrients, if there's a lot of sunlight, kelp can grow about 2 feet a day. Think about that, 2 feet a day. That's going to outgrow all of us in just a couple of days, right? So in ideal conditions, it can grow really fast and it's going to grow towards the surface. But do you think it's going to shoot right out the water once it reaches the surface? That would look pretty funny, right? To see these tall, thick stalks of kelp up out of the water. No, it doesn't make it all the way up out of the water. So instead, once it reaches the water surface, it folds over and it creates a canopy. And that's why when I drew my picture, if we go back to our picture really quick, it kind of folds over because it's not going to shoot up out of the water, but it's going to fold over and continue to grow in either direction, creating a canopy or a top layer of that kelp. And kelp forests can be really lush. As you saw, there's lots of kelp here. And this creates the homes for a lot of animals. But this kelp, even though it is creating the habitat and it's providing homes for animals, it's also part of that food web because it's also going to be providing food for some animals. So let's think for a moment. Who might use the kelp forest? Maybe we can see another video of an animal using the kelp forest. Aha, look at the animals here. Now these animals, this is another exhibit we have here at our aquarium. This is called Amber Forest. And these animals are using the kelp. In what ways do you see them using the kelp? My favorite animal in here using the kelp is this one right here. You may have noticed, you may have missed it. This thing right here might look like more kelp, but this is actually an eel. And so this eel is the same color as the kelp. Its body draped over it kind of looks like blades of kelp. And so it is using it for camouflage. Absolutely. And camouflage means to blend in. And so this eel is using that kelp for protection. And that is really important, but that doesn't put it in our food web. So there's actually an animal that eats kelp. There are a couple animals, but we're going to focus on one animal that eats kelp. Ta-da! Look at this. I know this is like such a charismatic animal. What do we have here? Any ideas? Have you seen this before? This is a sea urchin. So sea urchins love to eat kelp. In fact, all they eat is kelp. And when we're talking about types of eaters, right? Herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, an urchin is an herbivore because all it eats is kelp, like this thing it's sitting on right here. So urchins are herbivores because they eat kelp. And Because they are the first ones to eat that primary producer, they are also a primary consumer in that food web. Now, when you look at the urchin, what do you notice about it? It's kind of round. It's kind of spiky. Do you think you'd want to pet a sea urchin? You might not think you want to, but they're actually a really nice animal. This is basically what they do all day. They sit. They don't move too much. They might crawl a little bit, but they just sit all day, and their spines are just for their protection. So they don't shoot their spines out. If you pet them gently, they're not going to prick you with their spines. Their spines are just to make them look scary, because in fact, they're not very scary at all. They just kind of sit there and eat kelp. But you might be wondering, how are they eating kelp? Right? If you look at this thing, does it look like it has a mouth? I mean, it does in fact have a mouth because it's going to be eating something, but its mouth isn't anywhere that we can see right now. Its mouth is actually on the bottom. Oh, here we go. Oh, excellent, Jen. Thank you. I didn't even know we had this picture. Look at this. So, you may not realize we are looking at the same type of animal, but this is a sea urchin from the bottom. So before, we were looking at the top with all the spines, but now we've kind of turned it like this, stuck it on the glass of an exhibit, and we're looking at the underside. And this white spot in the middle, so you can get it right there, is its mouth. Now, urchins have 5 teeth. They're very small. They look like this, kind of like a claw. And we call it an Aristotle's lantern. Fancy name for their mouth. You don't need to remember that, but the mouth of a sea urchin has 5 teeth. That is important. They have 5 teeth, and all they eat is kelp. So even with teeth, oh, here we go. Here's the middle where their mouth is. Even with teeth, they're only eating plant life. So our urchin is going to be our primary consumer. It's going to be eating the kelp. So it's sort of our second part of our food web. So I'm going to find my purple. Now, we were looking at a purple urchin, but urchins actually come in a lot of different colors. Here along our coast, we have those purple urchins, which are a little bit smaller, and then we have larger red urchins. There are also green urchins and white urchins and pink urchins, so you can actually color your urchin whatever color you would like. I'm going to make a purple urchin, and it's really fancy how to draw an urchin. It's just a bunch of spikes, just like this. There's an urchin, but I'm going to draw a bunch of them because actually the urchin's favorite part of the kelp to eat is the very bottom. So I didn't draw. I'm going to move my board up a little bit. Zoom out. There we go. I didn't draw it. I'm going to add it in now. The bottom of the kelp is called a holdfast. And it looks kind of like roots, but instead of like a plant on land, it's not dug into the dirt. It's stuck on a rock. And while urchins will eat the blades or the leaves of a kelp, their favorite part is to eat that holdfast. So I'm going to draw a bunch of urchins because urchins are small and we find lots of them living in kelp forests. Like little fireworks. All right, so there are our primary consumers, are sea urchins. Now, urchins are important to have in an ecosystem because they do help us regulate our kelp. However, if we have too many urchins, what do you think might happen to the kelp? Think about it. If there's too many of an animal that eats the kelp, what happens to our kelp? It disappears, right? It can completely disappear because if our urchins are eating all of it, they can destroy a kelp forest. And so we need an animal that eats urchins. And that helps us balance out our food web, right? Our food web is important to have in an ecosystem, but it needs to be balanced because if it's unbalanced, it creates all kinds of chaos in an ecosystem. So it's important to have balanced levels or a good number of each animal that fills each level of the food web. Otherwise, things get a little bit wild and it can actually ruin a habitat. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we need an animal that eats urchins. Now, if we go back to a picture of an urchin for a moment. Do you think you would want to eat this? Do you think that looks like a good snack to just kind of pop in your mouth? No, right? Their spines are there to deter you, to stop you from eating them because they are super spiky. And if we were to take a bite of that, That would not feel good. Think about if you were to like put your hand on a cactus, which we are not supposed to be doing, but if you've ever been pricked by a cactus or a thorn on a rose or another flower, that's kind of like what an urchin feels like and what would feel like if we were to bite into it. But there are some animals who are able to eat sea urchins, and they have some special adaptations or special things on their body that help them. But it's important for us to have these animals in our habitats to help regulate the number of urchins. So let's take a look at one animal that we have here locally that eats our sea urchins and helps us keep those populations in check. Aha. What is this? Well, right, we know it's a fish, but do we have any idea what kind of fish this is? It's a very special fish. I think it might be one of my favorite Kelp Forest fish because it does some pretty cool things. It's a very interesting fish. This is called a California sheephead. And it's important that we call it a California sheephead because if you're looking up pictures and more information and you just type in sheephead, there are other fish called sheephead. So we call it a California sheephead because we find them right here along our coast in California. What do you notice about this fish? Does anything stand out to you? I notice the colors, right? It's got a couple different colors on its body. Its tail or backside is black, which kind of matches its head, but it's got this sort of pink middle. Now this picture kind of washes out the color a little bit. It's actually like a bright red color, that the stripe in the middle of its body. And then if you notice, it's got a white jaw. So if you touch your jaw, the lower part, this part of this fish is white. Now, the sheephead we're looking at here is a male. It's a boy sheephead. And I know this because this is what the boys look like. But the female sheephead, they look very different. Now, sheephead are really interesting, as I mentioned. All sheephead, when they hatch from an egg when they're born, are female. Every sheephead that has ever been born is born a female. And then, depending on food and depending on the other sheephead around, the strongest female, her body actually changes into a male. Now, this one here is still a male, but it looks a little bit more like a female. It's sort of in that transition period. So you'll notice its head's a little bit different shape, and it's still kind of got some pink in its body. I don't know that we have a picture of a female. If you watch our Blue Cavern feed, sometimes you'll see one. It's their body is fully pink. It's sort of this dusty rose color, as I like to call it. And their body is a lot more rounded versus that male we saw, that first picture, had that really square head. So as you can see here, remember the shape right here of this one's head? See how it's kind of rounded and sloped? And if we look at the other male picture, it's got more of a block head, if you will, this big bump on its head. And this bump is actually called a sagittal crest. It's a tangle of muscles. And you can see they have more muscles in their head. So even though that other one had the same coloring as this male, it was sort of in that process of changing. So it's a chemical change in their, a biological change in their body. They go from female to male. And then there's a dominant male. And then when that male dies, this next strongest female, her body will change. But it also happens when there's a lot of food around for them. So if there's a lot of sea urchins around, we might find a couple more males than we would see in other habitats. Now, we're going to draw our male, but before we go, I want to point out this picture, the jaw. So the lower jaw is going to be white on all of them. And if you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but there's one little tooth right there. Now, they have more than one tooth. And their teeth kind of look similar to human teeth. Not as many as we have, but they have these really big, thick teeth in order to eat sea urchins. So sea urchins, it's a kind of like a shell covering their body and all those spines. And the sheephead will use those teeth to pull them off a rock because they're able to stick onto rocks. They'll pull them off a rock and they'll kind of drop them and wait till they break, and then they can actually break into the shell and eat the animal on the inside. So let's take a look. Let's look one more time at the male because we're going to draw the male. Because I think this one's easy to draw because we can kind of use a rectangle as sort of our guide to draw our sheephead. But this is the fish that we're going to draw to help us regulate our sea urchin population. All right, so we are going to draw our sheephead. So I'm going to start with that kind of rectangle, as I mentioned. And that's the body. And then you can kind of pinch off the end, and they kind of have like a broom or a brush-shaped tail, like that. And then I'm going to make the front part of that rectangle kind of stick out a little bit. But they've got that big bump on their head. And let's take a look back and observe their fins for a moment. Aha. So they've got one fin kind of towards the front, and then they've got these two other little fins here. All right. So I'm going to draw a fin here. These little extra fins there. I'm going to draw the eye. Actually, not just yet. But I'm going to draw the lines for the color, right? Remember, they have that dark back, so I'm going to draw my black markers fading a little bit. And the black head, but we're going to leave the jaw white. And that fin was a little bit reddish too, I think. And then I'm going to draw red in the middle. And then let's see if I can make a little eye. There we go. Excellent. So we have our sheephead. So this is our fish that's going to help us regulate our urchin population. So if we were to draw arrows, let's get another color in here. How about orange? So our sheephead eats the urchins. Our urchins eat the kelp, and the kelp uses the sun for energy. Now, what we've drawn here is more of a food chain, right? Because it's one line, but there are other animals who might eat kelp. There are some other invertebrates who eat kelp, and we can add those in. There's another animal that eats urchins, and I'm not going to draw it because I'm not the best drawer, but it's another animal that I want to talk about because it fills the same role as our sheephead. And that animal looks cute and cuddly, but believe it or not, its favorite snack are those sea urchins. No worries. Now, this animal, we don't find them here along our Southern California coast, but they live in Kelp Forest more in Northern California, and they snack on a variety of things, but their favorite thing to eat are sea urchins. And they are what we call a keystone species because if we remove them from a habitat, it causes way more destruction than if we were to move another animal somewhere else in a food web. And that's the same thing that our sheephead does. Our sheephead is our keystone species because without the sheephead, to regulate urchin numbers, urchins will flourish. They'll keep growing and growing and growing and repopulating, and they'll eat our kelp forest. Whereas if we were to take an animal that's somewhere in the middle of our food web away, it might cause a little bit of disarray, but things will adjust. But if you take away a keystone species, it causes way more problems. So the keystone species here in Southern California for our kelp forest is our sheephead. But up in Northern California, it's going to be this guy, an otter. Sea otters. Now, sea otters, we don't find them here along our coast. We used to a long, long time ago, but they were actually hunted for their fur. And so our population is basically wiped out here in Southern California. But in Northern California, they have southern sea otters. And these sea otters, they love to eat sea urchins. And so they fill that role of a keystone species in a kelp forest habitat because they help regulate our urchin populations. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to draw an otter, but I will add it into our web. We'll say otters. This is how I get around drawing things that I'm not very good at drawing. I bet you all out there are amazing artists and can probably draw wonderful otters. And so I encourage you to explore a little bit, to look up some pictures of otters. Look at this otter. He's so excited. Look at those teeth, though. Those teeth are what they're going to use to help them eat. Now, unlike the sheephead who break open or who kind of pull off the urchins and drop them and break their spines off or even bite into them, otters actually use a tool. So they'll grab a rock and an urchin, they'll crack them together, and then they'll open it and then eat the inside. But those are some massive teeth that they have here. And here we can see an otter eating. Now, this otter here is eating shrimp. We don't often give our otters urchins here at the aquarium because they prefer other animals like shrimp and clam. But out in the natural habitat, urchins tend to be a favorite animal of sea otters. So cute. All right, everyone. So we are almost out of time, but I just want to review really quickly what we built today as we explored a food web. So as I mentioned, in any habitat you look at, you can build a food web or a food chain. Now, a food chain is linear, like we started to draw, but food web makes it a little bit more complex. There's a little bit more animals involved and things who eat things. But we have our sun, which provides energy for our primary producer, the kelp. And then we have our primary consumer, our sea urchins, that eat that kelp, that primary producer. And then we have two animals who fill that secondary consumer role. Our otter eats urchins, and our sheephead eats urchins. And all of these animals, all of these players in a food web are super important to keep an ecosystem healthy. And if we remove any of them, it can cause things to be out of balance. But there are some animals who cause more destruction if we remove them, such as otters and sheephead, because they play that keystone species role. They are super important helping to regulate all the animals, but it's important to keep everything in balance in an ecosystem. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed taking a little bit of a glimpse at a giant sea bass. No, a little glimpse at a food web. I hope you keep exploring today using our webcams or anything else, and you're welcome to join us. We've got more drawing on tap today. So at 10 o'clock, Cynthia is going to be doing a drawing class in Spanish, and we hope you'll join us then. Bye, everyone.